Yeah, sort of dug in there. So it's sizable.
Tom didn't want to continue in the fight, so.
No one does, but actually you deserve to be treated in a specific way for what you've achieved.
After months of lying in a dark room recovering from double eye surgery, after months of watching Dana White publicly question whether he even wanted to fight, after months of radio silence from the man who runs the company that holds his career in its hands, Aspinall said this: "Nobody in there is your friend." He wasn't talking about the guy who poked him in both eyes. He was talking about the UFC. And then 6 days after a single Zoom call with a man he had never formally spoken to before, Tom Aspinall climbed on a private jet with his father, flew to Monte Carlo, shook hands with boxing promoter Eddie Hearn, and became the first athlete to sign with the Matchroom Talent Agency, an organization that had only existed for 72 hours. Combat sports has not seen a move like this in years. And if you think this is just about commercial deals and sponsorship money, you are not paying attention to what is actually happening here. This is a UFC heavyweight champion, sitting on his couch with both eyes surgically repaired, watching his promoter do business on the exact opposite side of a war, and deciding to fire back. The fight that started all of this. To understand why Tom Aspinall ended up in Monte Carlo with Eddie Hearn, you have to go back to Abu Dhabi, October 2025. UFC 321, the heavyweight title defense that Aspinall had waited 15 months for, 15 months of watching John Jones stall and delay and ultimately walk away, finally arrived, and it lasted less than one round for reasons that had nothing to do with Tom Aspinall's ability as a fighter. Cyril Gane poked him in both eyes, once, then twice, within the same round. Aspinall stopped the fight. He told the referee he could not see. He told the cage-side doctor he had double vision and could not continue against one of the best strikers in the world while functionally blind. The fight was ruled a no contest. The crowd booed, and Aspinall, furious and humiliated, unloaded in the post-fight interview. What followed was almost worse than the fight itself. Dana White stepped in front of the cameras at the post-fight press conference and said that Tom Aspinall had simply not wanted to continue. He praised Gane's performance, said the Frenchman had Aspinall bloodied up, and used the phrase, "Tom didn't want to continue in the fight," in a way that anyone in combat sports understands as code for one specific thing: cowardice. For a man who had been fighting since he was 8 years old, that landed like a second punch on top of the first one. Aspinall responded on his YouTube channel. He said he was not a dummy. He said he was not going to fight one of the best strikers in the world with no vision in either eye because of a foul. He said directly, "I was very disappointed." He said Dana White had not spoken to him once, had no idea what was actually happening with his eyes, and had already been giving health updates to the media as if he had. And he made it plain. He did not have a personal relationship with Dana White. He went through Hunter Campbell. That was how it worked. The diagnosis that came back confirmed what Aspinall had been saying all along. Bilateral traumatic Brown syndrome. Not a minor eye poke, not a fighter looking for a way out. A documented medical condition requiring multiple surgeries, extended recovery, and an unclear timeline for return. 5 months later, White still had not spoken to him personally. He told Piers Morgan on television that he and Tom obviously needed to talk. He said this having not picked up the phone once, the number that made Eddie Hearn lose his mind. When Aspinall finally sat down with Hearn and showed him his UFC contracts, the man who had made careers out of negotiating massive numbers for Anthony Joshua and Katie Taylor went quiet. And then he said he was absolutely baffled. Hearn told Boxing News what he saw when he read those purses. He said that when Aspinall was headlining in front of 20,000 people on pay-per-view, as the UFC heavyweight champion, one of the most marketable British athletes in the sport, he was receiving probably half the amount of money that Hearn would pay a boxer for a British title fight at York Hall in Bethnal Green, in front of 1,200 people. York Hall. 1,200 people. The money Aspinall earned headlining pay-per-view events as the heavyweight champion of the world was less than the money a regional British title challenger would make in a small London club venue. That is what the UFC pays its champions. That is what Aspinall had been accepting because there was no one at the table telling him what those numbers actually meant. He had always negotiated his deals himself alongside his father Andy. Never had a manager, never had an agent, just two men from Wigan who knew how to fight and trusted the UFC to pay them fairly. Because that was the relationship and that was how it had always worked. What nobody told them, what nobody in that room ever volunteered, was how much the UFC was making off the other side of those same events. Aspinall said this directly. You've got to make as much money and be as ruthless as possible. That was not the quote of a man who felt taken care of. That was the quote of a man who had just found out exactly what he was worth and exactly how far short of that number every check he had ever received had fallen. The war that made this personal. To understand the full weight of what Aspinall signing with Hearn actually means, you have to understand the war that was already burning before his name entered the conversation. Dana White launched Zuffa Boxing at the start of 2026, a new promotion, Saudi money behind it, specifically Turkey, Al Sheikh and Sela, backed by TKO. White's stated goal was to enter boxing the same way the UFC entered MMA, by being louder, richer, and more aggressive than everyone already in the room. Eddie Hearn, whose Matchroom Boxing had spent 15 years building some of the biggest stars in the sport, was already in that room. He had built Anthony Joshua from prospect to world heavyweight champion. He had built Conor Benn from a kid trying to escape his father's shadow into a stadium headliner. And when Zuffa Boxing came calling, Ben went. The reported number was $15 million for a single fight. Hearn said he was devastated. He said Ben's legal team notified Matchroom without a personal call. He said he tried to reach Ben directly and couldn't get through. White's response was to go on camera and ask the world if there was a bigger pussy than Eddie Hearn. He said Hearn had the right to match the offer and chose not to. He said he didn't understand why you'd be upset about a friend making more money. Hearn fired back on the BBC, accused White of humiliating Tom Aspinall by insinuating he was a crybaby for stopping after an illegal eye poke. White said he would stay in his lane, until Hearn kept attacking, then said if Hearn wanted to fight, they could fight. Hearn called White out for having a new daddy in Turkey, Al Sheikh. White had previously jabbed that Hearn works for his father. It was the kind of sustained, public, escalating war between two powerful men with massive egos that neither side was particularly interested in ending. And then, right in the middle of it, Tom Aspinall signed with Hearn. When White was asked about it at the UFC 326 press conference the day after the announcement, he smiled and said, "We don't have any issues with Eddie." He also said he and Tom obviously needed to talk. He said this having still not talked to him. Hearn, for his part, was not pretending the timing was coincidental. He admitted openly that signing Aspinall amounted to a pawn in his beef with White, and then said in the same breath that he genuinely wanted to help and believed he would do an incredible job. He said in 16 hours he had already raised Aspinall's profile to the highest it had ever been. He said he would double it, then triple it. White signed Ben out of Hearn's camp. Hearn just signed the UFC heavyweight champion into his. What the deal actually means. This needs to be stated clearly because the noise around it has created some confusion. Tom Aspinall is still under contract with the UFC. He is not leaving. He is not going to box Eddie Hearn's fighters, at least not anytime soon. His stated goal is to return to the octagon as soon as his eyes allow and defend the heavyweight title. The deal with Matchroom Talent Agency is commercial and advisory, meaning Hearn's team handles sponsorships, brand deals, media appearances, and his public profile outside the cage. But it also means something else. It means that when the UFC sits down to renegotiate Tom Aspinall's contract, there will be a man on the other side of the table who has done this hundreds of times. A man who helped Anthony Joshua sign the biggest fights in heavyweight boxing history. A man who looked at Aspinall's UFC purses and said those words. Completely unfair. Hearn himself acknowledged the complexity of his actual role in UFC negotiations. He told reporters that whether he would personally be in the room with White when discussing fight terms would be decided based on what was best for Tom, and that if his presence would cause friction, it might not be him doing the talking. But he added, "There is no one better at having those conversations than me." Whether White, who does not historically respond well to fighters acquiring powerful advocates, will see that as a welcome development is a question that answers itself. Francis Ngannou left the UFC in part over money. Ngannou had no Eddie Hearn. He had no one who could look at his contracts and tell the room out loud that a heavyweight champion was being paid less than a British title contender fighting in front of 1,200 people in East London. Aspinall already has his first booking through Hearn. He will appear as a pundit for DAZN at the Callum Smith vs. David Morrell card in Liverpool on April 18th. It is a small thing. It is also the beginning of a process that, if Hearn is as good as his word, will eventually produce a version of Tom Aspinall who is commercially enormous. The kind of fighter the UFC simply cannot afford to underpay, without the world knowing exactly what that underpayment looks like. The domino that could fall next. The moment the Aspinall-Hearn deal was announced, Ariel Helwani said something that is going to live in people's minds for a long time. He said other MMA fighters will sign with Eddie Hearn next. Think about what that means if it is true. Not just for the UFC, but for the entire MMA ecosystem. The sport has spent 25 years operating under a structure where fighters negotiate their own deals, mostly alone, mostly without legal or commercial representation that can genuinely go toe-to-toe with a billion-dollar promotion. The UFC's business model has always depended on a degree of information asymmetry, on fighters not knowing what comparable fighters were making, not knowing what the event was worth, not knowing what the pay-per-view numbers translated to in terms of what they should have been paid. The moment a fighter hires someone who does know those things, the entire negotiation changes shape. Hearn did not sign Tom Aspinall because he wants to get into MMA promotion. He has said clearly that a boxing crossover is not the immediate plan. He signed Aspinall because the Matchroom Talent Agency needed a flagship client, and because signing the UFC heavyweight champion in the middle of a public war with Dana White was the most effective opening statement he could have possibly made. But the knock-on effect, the fighters watching, the fighters calculating, the fighters looking at their own contracts and then looking at what Hearn said about York Hall and 1,200 people, that is the thing that keeps promoters awake at night. Hearn also revealed he had his eye on Francis Ngannou, the former UFC heavyweight champion who walked away from the promotion over money, fought Anthony Joshua in a stunning upset, then signed with PFL before that relationship also eventually unraveled. Ngannou, the man who proved you could leave the UFC and remain relevant. The man whose departure from the UFC was supposed to be a cautionary tale, and instead became a template. If Hearn lands Ngannou as a second client alongside the current heavyweight champion, the Matchroom Talent Agency becomes something the MMA world has never had to deal with before. A well-funded, well-connected external force whose entire business interest is in maximizing fighter compensation at the UFC's expense. Dana White's response to Francis Ngannou leaving was to systematically diminish him publicly for years. His response to Tom Aspinall's deal was to say he and Tom needed to talk. The shift in tone is notable. The question nobody wants to answer. Somewhere underneath all of this, there is a question that the UFC does not want the mainstream audience to be asking, but which Tom Aspinall's deal with Eddie Hearn now forces into the open. It is not a complicated question. It is, in fact, the simplest question in business. If the UFC heavyweight champion, the man at the absolute top of the promotional pyramid, the face of the heaviest division in the sport, the guy whose name is on the poster when 20,000 people pay to watch, is making less money than a British title challenger fighting in a club venue, then what exactly does the UFC owe its heavyweight champion in exchange for holding his career rights? Aspinall said, "Nobody in there is your friend." He said, "You have to be ruthless." And then, 6 days after a Zoom call, he flew to Monte Carlo and sat across from the man his promoter was currently at war with. That is not the action of a man who is done with the fight business. That is the action of a man who has just figured out how it actually works and decided he is going to play a different game from here on out. Whether Dana White picks up the phone before that game gets considerably more expensive is now the only question that matters.